All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. We know it's a really hectic time for all of you, so we appreciate you taking the time to be with us for this conversation. On the line, we have me. I'm Heather, the coordinator of Title II Part A in Professional Learning at MSDE. We also have Cecilia Rowe, the director of Title II Part A, Dan Capozzi, the specialist in our office, and Jen Wojcik, an instructional assessment specialist. So as I mentioned in the email that I sent out last week, our original briefing agenda was going to focus on evaluation. But in light of the current circumstances, we felt it would be better to hold off on that agenda item until the fall so that we could be responsive to your more immediate needs. And we've made some really slight modifications to the Title II application, also known as Appendix D. So we're going to start our meeting by walking you through those changes. But the other two agenda items were those that were requested by you. The first request was for MSDE to share some best practices that we have seen with local school systems when adjusting their plans in light of school building closures. And the second item that was requested was for local school systems to share how they are adjusting their PD plans and any successes and challenges that they have faced when doing so. To be transparent, we haven't actually seen any best practices firsthand at this point. In fact, all the amendments that we've received so far have either been extensions, extensions only with no programmatic changes, or requests for programmatic changes that were already in the works prior to COVID-19. So it's likely because most school systems are still in the process of planning revisions to their PD plans. So they haven't yet communicated those plan revisions with us yet. So instead of gathering suggestions of the things that we have actually seen, we just gathered some research and came up with some suggestions that local school systems should consider when making adjustments to their professional learning plans. So we're going to share those with you. We're hoping that during the discussion part of today's webinar, some of you would be willing to share your thoughts about adjustments that you have made or are planning to make for the benefit of the group. So let's get started with modifications made to Appendix D. We'll share with you how the document has been streamlined for ease of use and shareability. We know that we'll all likely still be working remotely in some fashion while applications are being completed. So we wanted to be sure that the document was easy to share via Google Docs or other platforms of your choice. We'll also point out some of the other minor adjustments that we made to the language of the document, and we'll show you a new section in the application, the assurances section. Rather than take screenshots of the document, I thought it would be better to walk you through the actual document itself. So I'm going to pull that up now. It's going to take me 1 second to change screens here. Okay. Hopefully you can all see Appendix D. If you can't, can you let me know in the chat that you're not seeing Appendix D, but hopefully everyone is seeing Appendix D on their screen. So the first thing you'll notice is just the cover page. We put our new logo on here. We've been putting this logo on things for the last year or two, but we never actually made the shift and added it to our application. So this is kind of how you can know that you're working with the most recent version. You'll see the revision date of April 2020, and you'll see the new logo on here. So another change is on that first page, you'll be entering your full contact information here. So the name of your LEA, what fiscal year it is, who the Title II coordinator is, and what their contact information is. So you'll enter that information once on the first page. And then on the second page in the heading, you will enter the name of your LEA and your fiscal year one time. This is set up as a header. So once you enter the information here in the header, it will carry over onto all of the other pages. Nothing else in this front matter has changed. This is just the table of contents. You'll see that there's a new section here, section 7, the assurances section. But other than that, you know, this part hasn't changed. We still have the purpose of the grant listed here. That hasn't changed. We have the requirements of the LEA in order to be eligible to receive the subgrant. That hasn't changed. And we have the requirements for ongoing consultation. That hasn't changed either. So all of those parts are pretty much the same. So in section 1, targeted supports and consultation, you'll see if you're comparing this side by side with last year's application, you'll see that the language in this first sentence is different. This was the original intended language, but when the document was uploaded into the Lex plan last year, part of this first sentence was removed. So you'll see that in last year's plan, this was a sentence fragment that really didn't make much sense. And we sent out a corrective email last year about that, letting you know that part of the sentence had been redacted. But this was the original intention of that sentence. So it really hasn't changed. But if you're doing a side-by-side comparison, you'll see that the language looks a little different. It's just that the complete sentence is now there. That part has been corrected. None of the other questions in part 1 have changed. They're all the same. So section 2, administrative costs, still exactly the same. Nothing else has changed here. Section 3, ensuring equitable access. This is where you'll give us a snapshot of equity gaps that are occurring in your local school system. This section has not changed either. So section 4, there are some changes here that we want to point out to you. One is you'll notice that we added the word total in this first column header. Most of you only tell us the total public school costs in this section, and you do your calculations in the budget narrative, and that's what we want. What we don't want is to have full calculations in both the application and in the budget narrative, because what that forces us to do is to check the calculations twice, once in your application and once in your budget narrative, and to ensure that A, none of the calculations are incorrect, and B, that what you have in your calculations in your application matches identically to what is in your budget narrative. It's much more simplistic and streamlined if you just tell us what the total costs are in the application and then put all of your calculations in the budget narrative. So you'll see we added that word total here. I'm going to stop for just 1 second because I hear some background noise. So I think it's Judy. Let me mute you, Judy. There we go. If everyone can just ensure that they're muted, that would be helpful. Okay. The other change that you'll see here is we adjusted some of the language in the column that asks for a brief description of your activity. So the old language was timeline, audience, implementation, and evaluation. It was just single words. Those words were kind of vague, and these questions weren't always answered appropriately. Sometimes people combined the words implementation and evaluation. So what we did is we really just specified exactly what we meant by those words. So instead of implementation, we wrote implementation plan. Instead of audience, we wrote intended audience. Instead of timeline, we wrote specific timeline. And instead of evaluation, we wrote plan for evaluation. Now, one new piece here is anticipated outcomes. So this was not specifically outlined in the application last year or in previous years, but it is asked for in your in the monitoring documents, in your evaluation plans, in your interim reports, in your final reports. We're asking for your progress toward your anticipated outcomes. So it makes sense for this to also be a part of the application. I do hear a few people chat. It sounds like unmuting. So do we have some questions popping up? No. Okay. All right. If you have any questions, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you'd like. You can also type them in the chat box. Right now, I can't see the chat because I'm sharing this screen, but if I hear that a message is popping up in the chat, I'll pause and check the chat. Okay. The other thing I wanted to point out is that this new format makes it simple to delete unused rows. So in the past, we've gotten applications that are quite literally hundreds of pages. And one way that we can kind of reduce the size and the bulk of the document is to delete any rows that are not being used. So for example, if you don't have any activities in section 1.1.1, you can just highlight the row, right click, and click delete row, and the row disappears. Some people write NA. That's fine if you want to continue writing NA. It just kind of makes the document a little bit more cumbersome for you and for us. So if I were completing the document, I would delete the unused rows and only keep the rows that are being used. But that is your discretion if you'd like to delete the rows or not. I heard a chat pop up. So, oh, Robin's just saying, yay, great. Okay. So yeah, feel free to delete those rows. You'll also notice that the formatting is now vertical or horizontal alignment. Instead of horizontal alignment, it's aligned vertically. That's because when this document was downloaded as a Google Doc in the past, it made the chart very wonky. So Jen, and that is a technical word, wonky. Um, so Jen worked really hard to keep the integrity of the document while ensuring that if you download the document in Google Docs, it doesn't skew the chart and make it impossible to use. So that's the reason for changing the alignment from from landscape to portrait. So any questions about any of those before I keep on going? I'll pause for just a second. Okay. So that brings us to section 5, which is the alignment with challenging academic standards. Again, this is a requirement in the statute, so there's no changes here. Section 6, we do have one change. So this first question was added. This question has actually always been required in the statute, and we've always talked about this during monitoring, and we've required documentation of it, of ongoing consultation during monitoring, but we never explicitly asked for it in the application. So we met with Barb Scher, our ombudsman for equitable services, and she stressed that this really needs to be in every application, not just a part of monitoring. So we did add this one question about your plans for initial consultation, ongoing consultation, and how you manage disputes or complaints with your non-publics. So that part is added. The other two questions here, there's no changes. Those were already in the document before. So this is the new section, our assurances section. You've always submitted assurances with your application, so there's really no new additional action required on your part. We just added the requirement to the application. So there's nothing for you to do here differently. It's just that we've specified in the application that you must submit your assurances. Again, this is for just continuity between the titles. The other titles had this as parts of their application, and we did not. So we just added it so that we're being consistent across the title applications. So that's it. I'm going to pause for just a second. Are there any questions about any of the modifications or about the shareability of the document? I'll pause and give you guys a minute to type anything in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and share that way. Okay, I don't think there are any questions. Oh, I just heard one pop up. Give me one second. Okay, Jolene said, "Do you know when we'll be able to have a copy of the application?" Yeah, so we've already submitted this to Michelle Daly, who organizes the Lex plans at the state level. I'm not sure when she shares those, but I don't see any problem with us sharing that with you ahead of time so that you can kind of begin working on this on your own. Cecilia, unless you feel otherwise, I think it would be okay for us to send it out today to the group. Do you want to unmute yourself, Cecilia, and add anything there?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine with me. Absolutely appropriate. We're not going to make any additional changes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So yeah, we'll share it with you at the end of the presentation here. And Julianne just said she appreciates the shift to Google Docs. Us too. Yeah. So thanks for pointing that out. Okay. So let's see here. We're going to switch gears here and just chat for a few minutes about the national conversation around professional learning and some suggested considerations for when you are determining how you will adjust your professional learning plan based on the needs that have arisen due to COVID-19. Um, Before drafting or revising your professional learning plan, we think it's important for you to consider how your school system will reopen and how that reopening schedule would impact professional learning needs. Um, Maryland's recovery plan for education. I'm not sure if you all have had the chance to see that, but Dr. Salmon has referenced this document in the last briefing with Hogan. It is posted on the MSDE website, but I've also added it to our e-community. So if you have a chance, you might want to look through that recovery plan. And in that recovery plan, there are 5 potential reopening strategies outlined. Each one has its own unique set of professional learning implications. So just as an example, many of these strategies suggest that in order to reduce student-teacher ratios in classes, that fine arts teachers, PE teachers, health teachers will be included in rotations for small group instruction in the core content classes. This is directly out of that document. Um, this could mean that many special area teachers would be teaching a content that they've never taught before and have no formal training in. That would have some pretty significant implications for professional learning needs. Now, I do want to stress that the suggestions in the recovery plan are truly just options. It'll be at the discretion of the LEA to determine how they will reopen. The point here is that how your local school system chooses to reopen will likely significantly impact the professional learning needs of the educators and school leaders in your district. So it's a really important consideration before you start drafting that professional learning plan. So some needs, like that one, would be really easy to identify. It's important to gather feedback from stakeholders to identify needs that might not be so evident to those who are designing the professional learning plan. So you'll want to consider seeking feedback from administrators, teachers, students, coaches, and mentors regarding their current and also their anticipated future needs. This could be accomplished through surveys, focus groups, other methods. And again, this is not a new concept. Regulation requires that LEAs conduct needs assessments before planning professional learning, but it's important to consider how your needs assessment data points and your processes and your audience might need to be adjusted in light of current circumstances. You'll also want to consider assembling an advisory group to influence your goal setting and to offer feedback on the professional learning plan that you have drafted. Your advisory group, it'd be great if it included a few students, teachers, some content specialists, administrators, coaches, mentors, ensuring that who is on the focus group or the advisory group represents the diversity of your school system. You also might want to consider including association leaders into the conversation to promote collective support. Each person that you include will review your plan within the context of their own unique experiences, and they'll be able to offer perspectives that may not have otherwise been considered.
Hey, Heather, it's Billy.
Yeah, sure.
So most systems are likely to have a reentry work group as well, and part of that work group will be um, uh, they'll deciding the professional development needed for the reentry plan. Is it okay to sort of blend the two of them together in the suggestion that you just made?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that would be probably the best idea of all. Yeah, for sure.
Thanks,
I'd like
appreciate
to
that.
I'd like to jump in for a second and also remind you that the CARES money is going to be coming, and that has to be used for COVID purposes, recovery kind of purposes from COVID. So you may want to consider that as well. I mean, do some braiding of funding and include that in your plan.
For sure. Thank you, Cecilia.
Yep, and other titles also have flexibility for professional learning as well. So Title One, Title Three, and Title Four, there's opportunities there for braiding as well. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So next steps, when drafting your professional learning plan, you should really determine what changes and priorities in your district are going to require the most significant professional learning support for teachers. This is definitely going to vary from district to district, but these are just a few items that we would expect to be pressing priorities. So first, teachers need to know how to use the formative assessment process to identify critical prerequisite skills that may not have been mastered due to school building closures. What data is showing us is that schools in low-income communities are seeing fewer than half of their students participating in online instruction, while those schools who have selective admission processes or who are in more affluent areas, they have closer to 100% participation. So it's essential that teachers are able to recognize and address these gaps that have most certainly been widened from the closure of school buildings. The school systems should also consider how they will accelerate learning so that all students are being taught on grade level standards, which this is likely going to require some adjustments to existing curriculum and pacing guides. You might also want to consider what support students and teachers will need when restarting school in light of recent trauma that they may have experienced. Where feasible, school systems could provide training to teachers to prepare for those needs if they've not already done so. You may also work with school counselors and school psychologists and behavior interventionists to anticipate and meet the needs of students who really rely on those school counseling and school psychological services for socio-emotional support, post-secondary planning, and for those kids who additional time at home or away from school in and of itself could be emotionally stressful. So when we're using that word educators, we don't just mean teachers here. We really are thinking about anyone in the building who is working with kids. Most opening plans will also include a period of distance learning for some, if not all students. So promoting educational equity while students learn at home is really important as ever. And to do this, school systems really should ensure that all the learning materials provided to kids are meeting the specific needs of students with disabilities and English learners while still promoting mastery of grade level standards. So school systems also must consider how they'll support teachers in their ability to plan and deliver instruction remotely while protecting student privacy. This is kind of a no-brainer here. The pedagogy for instructing online is not the same as the pedagogy for instructing in a face-to-face environment. And we're seeing that teachers are learning very quickly that what works in a traditional classroom setting is not always working in an online setting. So school systems are going to need to spend some time with teachers if they haven't already around the pedagogical shifts required to teach effectively in a remote setting. So not just here's how you use this tech tool, but here are really the pedagogical underpinnings of remote teaching. So we've also seen that student privacy concerns have arisen during the period of school building closures. Um, Many expensive and formerly unusable platforms have offered their services for free during the pandemic, which is great in a lot of ways. But this new like technological landscape for schools, it feels so unprecedented that some teachers have bypassed the typical vetting procedures that they would normally undergo for new tech products. They're adding these free products directly to their single sign-on platforms for student usage. They're sending them out to parents, kind of without going through that vetting process. So while many school systems have provided support on the pedagogical aspect of teaching from a distance or how to use tech tools, school systems might also consider providing some refreshers for teachers and for administrators on the importance of protecting student privacy while instructing remotely. So I'm going to pause for a second. Any questions about just some of these? Again, these are just some priorities that have kind of arisen on the national landscape.
I would also
Heather,
like to add a caution that even though a lot of these things are free right now, they won't remain free. So be careful in choosing and making these free products a part of what you're doing, because if you become reliant upon them or your teachers become reliant upon them, there could be a cost down the road. So just be really careful in choosing the things that you're going to be using, even if they are free.
Good point.
Heather, it's Billy again. One of the things that we're struggling with is we are spending most of our time with teachers in Microsoft Teams and with students in Google Meets because they are vetted within our organization. We know the security risks, and we know that it doesn't involve many security risks. But what we're struggling with is a large platform that we can actually deliver good PD from. Microsoft Teams is a great meeting space, but it's not a great PD space in terms of creating breakout rooms and lots of different things like that. I'm wondering if you all have any recommendations around that, or if my colleagues on the phone have any recommendations around that. And is that an allowable expense within the grant to purchase a PD platform for delivering large-scale PD? You know, when I have to deliver PD to my fourth grade math teachers, that requires 450 fourth grade math teachers. And so Microsoft Teams just isn't cutting it.
Yeah, and we definitely have space in our presentation today to kind of hear from other districts about what they're using and what's working. So this is a great way to kick that portion off after, you know, when we get to those slides. I can say, yes, it is an allowable expense to purchase an online PD platform for sure. We have LEAs who are already using Title II funds for that purpose. So that's no problem. Personally, I have been as a participant. I have been in Zoom breakouts, and I have also been in WebEx breakouts. So as a facilitator, I haven't used either one as the person creating those breakouts. But I was just on a call yesterday with some folks in Michigan, and they were sharing the capabilities of Zoom and how you can pre-assign breakout rooms using Zoom. I know you can do the same thing in WebEx. Now, I do know there are some security concerns with Zoom. I know at the state, we've been asked not to use Zoom. So I don't want to recommend that because I'm just not an expert on all of the security risks, but I have participated in breakout sessions that have been pre-assigned to me in both of those platforms, WebEx and Zoom. And I think when we get to the share out slides, let's open that up as a good kickoff question to the rest of the districts, just to hear how they're managing this challenge, because I'm sure you're not alone in that challenge.
You know, there are different levels of protection with Zoom. So there are different security measures that are used. If you have a contract with Zoom, a paid contract that has security behind it, then it is safe. But if you're using some of the free versions of Zoom and other versions that don't have that security behind it, then you really need to be cautious about using it. But I know that US Ed has done Zoom meetings with us, as has West Ed, but they have higher level paid versions of Zoom that they are using. So Heather's caution is correct, but it's not across the board with all Zoom meetings. You just need to know if the Zoom meeting or the person that you're working with has a paid version that is secure.
So the other thing I'll add to that, Cecilia, if you remember from our IT office, is one of the issues with Zoom was that when you download the software, oftentimes there is malware attached to the software. So what they suggested was, regardless of whether the organization has a paid account or not, that participants don't download the extension. Rather, they use the web version of Zoom, so that there's nothing being installed on your system. Okay, so we'll table that question about what platforms other districts are using. I do think it's a really important question, and toward the end of the presentation, we'll open that up to the other districts to chime in. Any other questions about determining changes and priorities for your educators before we move on to school leaders? Okay. So priorities for school leaders, such as administrators, coaches, mentors, they've also shifted pretty significantly. And when you're crafting your professional learning plan, it's important to consider which changes and priorities will have the most significant professional learning implications for those school leaders. We know that many teachers are struggling to adapt to the online environment, and one of the most effective ways to improve teacher practice is through observation and feedback. But school leaders must develop appropriate observation and feedback methods that are relevant specifically to the online environment. So, are school leaders prepared to recognize effective pedagogy, effective course content, and effective facilitation practices in an online environment? And are they prepared to provide the just right amount of feedback to teachers to improve their practice? For most school leaders, the answer is likely not yet. Um, this is probably an area where significant professional learning could be needed in many local school systems. School leaders will also likely be asked to develop and communicate policies, expectations, and support systems for students, teachers, and parents. For that bigger picture communication, they may be preparing FAQs where they outline details of how the school will operate during a closure and after reopening so that staff and parents are on the same page. These documents will likely include logistics such as attendance policies and how to access online learning tools, but also big picture concepts like what the school is doing to meet the academic and socio-emotional needs of students. These planned communications alone are certainly not going to be sufficient. So school leaders are also going to be tasked with developing systems of support for parents and teachers so that they can ask for help in real time when needed. To ensure equitable access, schools should provide this information about resources and supports to families in multiple languages and provide outreach to families who may otherwise not easily be reached, specifically including those families who are in temporary housing. This can be a really complex task. So many districts are likely going to draft these policies and support systems on behalf of schools, but some districts are going to give schools flexibility to determine expectations and supports on a school by school basis. And in those circumstances, the school system should consider what capacity building might be necessary in order for school leaders to do this effectively. Before I turn it over to Jen to talk about next steps in revising or drafting your professional learning plan, I just want to mention that as I was drafting the bullets for these slides, I was feeling a lot of anxiety and very overwhelmed by all of these professional learning implications. So I can't even imagine how you guys are feeling. I'm sure you're feeling the same. And by no means are we suggesting that school systems must address all of these as priority areas in professional learning plans. Rather, we just wanted to try to capture some of the major themes that we have seen emerging on the national level as potential areas of need, either to reinforce the needs that you've already identified or to potentially spark some conversations around needs that you may not have considered or yet identified. So I'm going to pause here for just a minute and see if we have any questions or any thoughts about determining changes and priorities for school leaders. Okay, doesn't look like it. So after identifying the key professional learning priorities for educators and school leaders, the next step would be to develop a scope and sequence for how you plan to address those needs. And Jen's going to share some thoughts about that next up with you.
Yes. So you will want to start by drafting the intended outcomes for educators and school leaders. Consider what knowledge, attitudes, skills, aspirations, and behaviors need to grow, shift, or change in order for you to meet your outcomes. You'll want to consider how induction programs will incorporate your newly identified priorities. It is quite possible that teachers new to the profession will not have had training to prepare them for this type of virtual learning environment. The same can be said for new administrators. How will you modify your induction programs, both for new teachers and for new administrators, to meet these newly identified needs? And because the timeline for the pandemic is unclear, it may be advisable to set both short-term and long-term goals in case it lasts longer than we anticipate. So next, you'll want to consider how the training will be delivered initially and also how you'll continue to support educators and school leaders after the initial experience. Some trainings may not require follow-up support, but many will, and this is just an important consideration not to be overlooked. One way to do that would be to consider how you will leverage your coaches and mentors to support the new learning of teachers and how administrators will provide support to their educators as well. What role will the professional learning facilitators play in terms of initial delivery and ongoing support? Pre-existing roles and responsibilities may need to shift in order to meet the new outcomes identified on your professional learning plan. And because this is a time of uncertainty, you'll want to create an implementation timeline that is realistic and achievable while understanding that these changes could last a long time. While we hope that school will return to normal sooner rather than later, the truth is we just don't know. So it's important to think long term. And while we would love to front load as much as possible before kids are back in the classroom, that is not a likely scenario. And then finally, as you know, evaluation is important to ensure that your adjusted professional learning plan is effective. So you want to be sure to consider during the planning phase how and when you will collect evidence to measure whether or not you're on the right track to achieving your outcomes. Waiting until after an activity has taken place to determine the evaluation method is not an effective strategy. So I will pause for any questions before turning it over to Dan. Okay, so I'm going to hand things over to Dan, who will facilitate some sharing among the local school systems.
Good morning, everyone. It looks like we actually have our first point for discussion, but take a look at the 3 questions that are there and read them for yourself. And if you have any thoughts about any of the 3 or any part of the 3, feel free to unmute yourself or to put a response in the chat box. But to kick things off, we did have a question already about professional learning platforms, which ones are being used by the local school systems as of right now. And I noticed that Joni had put in the chat box that her system is now using Zoom to have meetings for professional development. Anyone else want to add a thought or add to the conversation?
Good morning. This is Damon Jones from Prince George's County Public Schools. We're also planning to do a virtual induction training this month, actually next week. So we're going to use the Zoom format. But one of the things that we found is Zoom actually is very compatible with Google. Google's the main platform that we use in our system to communicate. So Zoom works a little better with Google than versus WebEx.
Thank you, Damon. Just a question. So did you actually purchase the Zoom platform with some of the precautions that were already mentioned?
No, we've not purchased it, but yes, we've realized some of the limitations with that was stated earlier with some of the breakout rooms and things of that nature. So next week's presentation is really a trial run for us because right now we have roughly about 250 teachers registered for the virtual session. So we'll see, how the kinks work out.
Right.
Damon, be careful if you're using the free version. Make sure you've got a password set up and you've got some other means of ensuring security, because that free version, you could have all kinds of people bombing your meeting. I mean, it could be an issue.
Thank you. We'll keep that in mind. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we had an MSDE meeting that was hacked, and there was some unsavory content being shared by the hackers across the whole platform. So it's definitely a concern. Okay, let's see. Colleen said St. Mary's uses a paid version of Zoom. Karen said they're not allowed to use Zoom at all in their system, which is similar feedback that we've received. Joni, what are you guys? Oh, Joni's using Zoom as well. Okay, and with large amounts of teachers.
And you can see we're using Google Meets. The two platforms at MSD that are approved is the Google Meets as well as WebEx, but we have limited numbers of people because our WebEx is based upon numbers of users. So there was limited number of people who have rights to WebEx. But those are the two platforms that MSDE is allowed to use. The Google Meets, which is what we're using for this meeting, as well as WebEx.
So it's an interesting, Julianne posted an interesting question about piggybacking on an RFP and if MSDE would consider investigating. I think that's something that we could consider, and Cecilia, feel free to jump in. I think in collaboration with Val's office, maybe just put out some recommendations. I'm not sure about an RFP, a larger RFP, but.
An RFP for what? WebEx, Zoom? What are you thinking, Julianne?
So I guess wherever we land, so like hearing some of the best practices and hearing the successes and concerns that districts have had, if we can do some investigating and land in a place where we can get some traction, it would be appealing if many of us were exploring the same company. It would remove some of the red tape of all of us going out to bid separately and the sort of time that takes when we don't really have time right now, when we really need to move, I guess, with a viable alternative. It could reduce costs for all of us too if we had many of us using it. So to what extent might the state be able to help us, whether, like Heather said, it would be in terms of a recommendation or narrowing the scope of who we look at and maybe some rationale behind it. That would just help perhaps expedite us being able to make good decisions in real time.
Yes, I can definitely have that discussion with Val first and then move it to IT as well. I do want you to know, though, having come from a large district and now being at the state level, procurements are much more slow at the state level than they are at your level. But we can talk about it and see what we can do. Somebody mentioned something about not WebEx. there are all different ways of using WebEx. There's WebEx meetings, there's WebEx events, there's WebEx training. There's even a special WebEx event where you can hold actual conferences. It's more for conferencing and kinds of like things like that. So if some of you have been having a little bit of issues with WebEx, it could just be that you don't understand all of those different options and how all those options work. I do agree that sometimes until you really get into using it, it's not necessarily intuitive in how to use it and which type of meeting is the best one for you to set up. I set up the WebEx meetings for the assistant superintendents, and I use the WebEx training. But the only reason I do that, and that has a lot more restrictions, but the reason I do that is it has also more capabilities. So if all of a sudden Dr. Sprankle or Dr. Williamson decides they want to do breakout rooms, I can do that with WebEx training. I can't do that with a WebEx meeting, which is much more simple and easier to use. So everything has drawbacks and pros and cons, but I think you just have to decide what's best for you. Absolutely, I will talk to Val and to Dale in our IT group about the possibility of a statewide procurement of some kind.
And if not that, then at least some feedback on pros and cons of different platforms, so that you, if we're not able to arrange that larger RFP, we could at least give some feedback on suggested platforms. I believe that already exists. I want to say that Val sent something out about that a while ago, but I think it was more in terms of use for students, not for professional learning purposes. So I think reframing it and asking again, that's definitely something we can do.
Going back to our list, we still have 3 questions there. What new professional learning needs are arising in your local school system? How are you adjusting your professional learning plans to meet those needs? And how are you using Title II Part A funds to support those plans? The second question is one that actually was a suggested topic by one of our colleagues. So does anyone have any thoughts about ways that you're adjusting your professional learning plans to meet the needs that have arisen because of the pandemic? And is anyone using Title IIA funds in a way to support any of the new needs that have arisen? Well, seeing no thoughts or comments, should we just move on to the next slide? We also wanted to find out if any of you have had what successes and challenges you've had so far in dealing with your professional learning that you feel that you would like to share with the group. I thought I saw in the comments earlier that Jeff in Carroll County has been presenting a number of professional development experiences that have been through webinars that have been multiple and differentiated, and that they've had great participation. And
this
Jack?
is Diane Workman from Calvert County. I'd like to give a shout out to Jackie Jacobs, who I believe is on this call, and she is our supervisor of digital learning. And she and her team have been offering a series of webinars every week related to teaching in a digital environment. So I'm really putting her on the spot, but we have had tremendous participation in the webinars. And the team has just gone above and beyond to support our teachers. So I don't know if Jackie wants to say anything more about the webinars, but they've been very effective in sort of reducing the anxiety of some of our teachers who are not as tech savvy and haven't used our learning management system in the past. but they're feeling much more comfortable because of the support by Jackie and her team.
Thanks, Diane, for the shout out. It's just been really amazing. We started with Schoology a couple of years ago, although not all of our teachers kind of bought into it. And with this occurring, that is the main platform that everybody needed to use. So right before we started, we took 2 days, offered trainings through webinars that were about 50 minutes long. We continue to offer them each week, and we continue to have more and more teachers join, learning the different aspects, and then making sure we also include the pedagogy behind it of why you would want to use this tool, how you use this tool. We did the same thing. We've called them virtual classroom meetings, and really have asked our teachers to think about when and how they have virtual classroom meetings. We're currently using Microsoft Teams and the Schoology conferencing that is within the Schoology platform. And we've had a lot of turnout for that. So we try to provide it just in time when they need it. So we make sure we offer them over and over again each week so that teachers can participate when they need to. We've also offered a self-paced course within our learning management system that has how-to videos and step-by-step instructions. So if they learn better that way. And then we've provided office hours with our integration specialists for some one-on-one support. So it's been a great success.
Great, thank you, Jackie.
Hey, Dan, this is Jeff from Carroll. Hey, thanks for the shout out about what we were doing there. I appreciate you hitting out in the chat, but just a little detail on what we're doing. Ours are just set up for drop in. We post a calendar, a 2-week calendar. We're in round 3, so we're up to about 75 different webinars that we have run on various topics. When we started this whole thing off, they were more on the how-tos, like, of course we had the week of planning on Google Classroom and all that stuff. Carol sort of was dipping their toe in that one before all this happened, and now we had to jump all in. But so after those, we got into some of the how-tos a little deeper, Screencastify, Nearpod, FlipDeck, all the different extensions. But now we're moving into some of the topics that were just referenced there to more the pedagogy, the instruction. And we have teacher leaders hosting these sessions. We have folks from across the system. It's really been great. And in Carroll, we're a medium-sized system. We've had over 2,000 participants in all of our webinars so far. So we're really excited about where that's going. Shout out to Anne Arundel out there. We stole an idea from you guys on the Lunch and Learn series that we saw you guys were running. So we're doing some stuff on Lunch and Learn series. And again, they're just drop-ins hosted by lots of different folks. My team, I just reached out to schools to do it. And again, people just come into real informal chats. They collaborate, they chew. We hear about best practices going around the system. So really, in a nutshell, I mean, the silver lining in this whole sort of mess that we're in is that we have these platforms and people are able to reach out to one another across the county in relatively simple ways and hear about what they're doing, the successes they're having. So it's really been positive on our end, and it's been great. So I just wanted to share that with everyone.
Thank you, Jeff. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Dan, I didn't want to interrupt you. This is David Jones again from Prince George's County, and I wanted to kind of continue the positivity that Jeff was just talking about with, us somewhat adapting to some of the challenges we had. So we started actually 2 new work streams. We already had a PEAT team that conducts our induction training on a monthly basis, and they'll be doing a virtual session this month for that. But from that work group, we started another work stream called PEAT XP. And the PEAT XP team is basically our new virtual learning professional development work stream. So they initially just put out a needs assessment to all of our teachers to assess what do they need around our new distance learning model, because curriculum instruction just put that out roughly about 6 weeks ago. So they've also instituted, the mentors have instituted a weekly mentor moment where they're sharing county initiatives and providing live action webinars with the PXP team to address any of their questions around distance learning.
Thank you, Damon. Jackie in Harford County has said that they've designed bite-sized PD to support teachers. They know that teachers are overwhelmed and they want to keep it the most meaningful opportunities for them. Let's see. Sandy Pasella in Worcester has mentioned the technology coach, who's supported in part by Title II, has done an excellent job in providing a wide menu of learning opportunities on how to use our learning management system. And I think that covers most of the questions or most of the comments that address those questions. As far as reminders go, just a few items. Just want to remind everybody that the last day for FY19 grant amendments is May 15th, 2020. That's this Friday. So if you're considering an amendment, at least let us know electronically what you're doing, and then you could always send in the signed versions at another time. Hopefully all of you have gotten the information about the electronic signatures and the documentation that needs to go along with them as well.
I just want to jump in there, Dan, that this is for your initial amendment. So you can, if you've already put in a request to extend the grant period for FY19 and you're considering submitting another amendment for programmatic changes later, that is okay. But the last day for extending the grant period is this Friday. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Also, we have a webinar scheduled on May 28th from 12 to 1 o'clock, and the topic of that will be the consolidated application. Title II and Title IV, Title II and Title IV have been working to consolidate the applications process, and we are interested, for those folks who are interested in learning about the trial or the pilot of that, you want to join us on May 28th. Even if you're not interested in learning, being a part of the pilot, it may be of interest to some of you just to know how the applications have been consolidated. So there is no commitment if you join the webinar, but for those of you that have any interest at all, May 28th, 12 to 1 p.m.
Yeah, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email with all the login information and everything for that as well. So do we have any questions, comments, any additional thoughts before we wrap up here? Karen, no, we have not sent the calendar invitation yet. We will put it out in email, and we will specifically send the calendar invitation to those of you who requested it.
Heather, somebody earlier in the chat asked if you know if Title IV is going to use the Google form for their application this year as well.
They are not. They revised their application to be a fillable form, which is not Google friendly. So we also were considering changing our document to a fillable form just because it is cleaner. It's a nice clean document. However, it's not easily shareable. You have to download the document, make your changes, and then re-upload it. For that reason, we decided not to revise into the fillable format. We decided just to make it easier to share via Google Docs. So we kind of had to do the trade-off, but Title IV decided that they wanted to continue with the fillable format. So theirs will not be accessible from Google Forms. Okay, looks like people are just starting to sign off. So we do appreciate everyone being with us today. And Dan and Cecilia and Jen and I will hang on here for a few more minutes if there are any other questions. But otherwise, have a great afternoon, and we'll send out this recording, and all of the resources that we mentioned are on the eCommunity. So you can find the PowerPoint, Maryland's plan, and other resources that we referenced. They're all there on the eCommunity. So have a good afternoon.